Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event, London's Road Network from Red to Green. This is a webinar we're holding in partnership with Environmental Defence Fund Europe, and we're going to be discussing red routes and whether they have a place in policy in London today and, importantly, for tomorrow. We're very pleased to have all of you with us. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rob Whitehead. I'm Director of Strategic Projects at Centre for London, and I'm going to be your chair today. Just a few words on Centre for London and why we're holding this event. We are the capital's dedicated think tank. We develop new solutions, policies for London's critical challenges, and we advocate for a fair, sustainable and prosperous global city. So we do research, we stage events like this, we convene and we influence. So let's turn to our subject today, red routes. I remember when these were introduced back in the 90s. Cars aren't allowed to stop on red routes. So they kind of reinforce, this policy reinforces their role as the capital's major thoroughfares. And by doing so, they aid commuting, they aid freight flows, and they help us all get deliveries to our doorsteps, which are increasingly popular. As a result, the Red Routes network, which is managed directly by Transport for London, unlike other roads in London, now boasts levels of nitrogen dioxide pollution some 57% higher than the average London road. And many Londoners live, work and go to school on or near these busy roads. So they're breathing in higher and often illegal levels of air pollution every day. Today, we're going to explore the history of red routes and see whether they remain fit for London today, especially in light of the twin challenges of climate change and our growing understanding of the health impacts of polluted air. The pandemic's put incredible pressure on local government and neighbourhoods, but it's also encouraged a kind of new creativity and experimentation in transport policy. So we feel the time's right, especially in the run-up to a mayoral election, to be moving the debate forwards on this important issue. Thanks again to Environmental Defence Fund Europe. We're going to be hearing more from Ollie, from them in a moment. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to do this event. We want to see what you think are the goals of red routes. So we're just going to put a quick poll up. This is a little moment for paying a bit of attention. And I want you to look at this poll and tell me, have a quick read, and select every one that you think has ever been part of the red routes goals. So the red routes exist to do this stuff. Select the ones you think have ever been part of the red route, if you like, policy framework. I might have to put my glasses on to see if I can read them again. So we've got facilitate the movement of people and goods in London, encourage walking, improve conditions for cyclists, better conditions for people with disabilities, priority for buses, improve local environment and impact of congestion, car commuting, reducing traffic, and helping with traffic accidents. So vote now if you can, and we'll see the results in a second. So the team, if everyone's had a chance, could close that off. Let's see what the results are. Here we go. Facilitate the goods of the movement of people and goods in London. Yep, unsurprisingly gets lots of votes. Encouraging walking doesn't get many. Only 12% think that was ever part of the red routes policy framework. And you can see not many of the others, apart from priority for buses, got many votes. Now, what's surprising to me, and possibly to you as well, given how you voted, is that all of those goals have at some point been part of the red routes formal policy framework. Surprise to certainly me, and certainly food for discussion as we move on. Thank you for doing that. I'm going to close that off. So I'm going to hand over now to Ollie, Ollie is Head of Policy and Campaigns at Environmental Defence Fund Europe, EDF. I think we'll probably call him for short for the rest of this event. He's going to give us a brief overview of red routes and some of the issues associated with them. Ollie, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everyone joining us today and to my fellow panelists. That was some really great context, and that poll really is quite striking, actually, to think that all those objectives were meant to be part of the red routes, and unsurprising that a lot of people voted predominantly about movement of goods. And the roads we're talking about are actually just 5% of London's roads, but they're carrying up to a third of London's traffic every day, and very important roads for the city to function. But for other people, they actually are the most dangerous roads, and to many of us, they're actually the most polluted roads as well. And the whole purpose of today's event really is to start the conversation about the future of these roads. I think it's always sensible to be reviewing policy after 30 years. Things have moved on, and I really want to stress also, this is intended to very much be a hive mind style session. We're not going to kind of bring all the solutions today, but it is a conversation starter. We had big road building policy in the 60s and the 70s. We then eventually ended up with road widening policy, and London had about 900 miles of roads that were kind of safeguarded so that we could keep expanding them and get bigger as traffic kept increasing. And then eventually we got to this policy of safeguarding in the 80s, and then came along these clearways, the red routes, where we felt we didn't need to keep widening the roads, but we actually had to keep them functioning so that we had as much traffic as possible to go down them. But when this policy came in, we're talking, it was before smartphones, it was before diesel cars were very dominant on the road, it was before e-commerce, and we were all getting our home deliveries, and of course it was before the Paris Agreement as well. And things have really started to move on now. And vehicle use has increased. I mean, even in the past 10 years, we've seen 3.9 billion more miles being driven on London's roads. So this has led to a lot of health inequity issues, quite frankly, especially these roads. And they've got the highest levels of air pollution, as you were talking about, schools, patients, hospitals, and even residents of care homes, when we look at where they're situated in the capital as well, who are very susceptible to air pollution. And there's a high level of road danger as well. We're actually seeing 37% of all road traffic fatalities in London being on this road network. And it makes you think, if you've got the highest levels of air pollution, highest levels of collisions, surely it's time to actually talk about these. But there are other environmental and behavioural stresses that we really need to take into account. And it's been great to structure this whole conversation with Centric Lab, and you'll hear from Araceli as well. And there's also, to some extent, I can contribute my own lived experience to this conversation. I have previously been a planner, Transport for London, in the team who would manage and improve this road network. And I know there are some great people there with a lot of ambition, but occasionally it is a very difficult job, because I've also experienced trying to make improvements to these roads and actually being sort of talked down because of the impact on traffic levels. And I've also lived on a red route, and I was lucky enough to change those circumstances, but I experienced high levels of noise and air pollution, and believe me, it's not very fun at all. Most recently, I had a conversation with a councillor over in Kensington who actually took the council to court, believe it or not, over the red routes coming in. But she explained to me how a lot of the issues have come to fruition. Subsidence in buildings. There was no double glazing installed to protect vulnerable communities that live on the roads. Community severance. And pieces are starting to change. We've seen some transformation, but let's take Vauxhall as an example. I mean, many people might know the 6-lane one-way system going around that area. There was a consultation in 2014 to change that. It's not going to be finished till 2025. So we're talking like a 10-year turnaround to actually make some transformation. And it's all part of a global movement. We're seeing cities in Seoul, for example, in Paris and Barcelona really changing how their cities function. And it's about a short, medium and long-term vision. I'm not saying things are going to change overnight, but we did have the Roads Task Force back in 2012, which the previous mayor did. And they talked about London needing a plan for the inner ring road, for example, the Euston Road, to be developed as a matter of urgency. And here we are 9 years later, and I'm not sure that plan ever came to fruition. And I want to stress it's not about one size fits all. We all understand London is a very broad place and look at central London, the comparison to inner London and outer London, the difference between the north and south circular roads is a real case in point here. And we have to accommodate local needs, but we also need some sort of basic level of service, I think, in the future, thinking about speed limits, cycling infrastructure, pedestrian crossings. And I also want to emphasize it's not about where people live as well. So these roads, not only people are living on them, but it's about the future of our local high streets. You know, I'll give you an example of Holloway Road, which, you know, actually has, you know, 3 lanes of traffic on either side running through it. And it's everyone's local high street in that area. So there are also unfair economic consequences of how these road networks currently function, as well as where people live. So for me, I think, you know, I'll probably just end this intro in saying, like, it's about doing more, not less, especially in the context of a lot of other discussions going on at the minute. We're not going to have an overnight solution, but we might not necessarily need a long-term solution. I think we should be looking at short and medium-term solutions. And I'd love to work with everyone on this call to help start this conversation and develop a better vision for this road network.
Ollie, thank you very much. That's a really helpful overview. Thanks for sharing. In terms of the format for the rest of the event, our panelists will now share a bit of response to that, build on what Ollie said. We'll get a bit of a discussion going, and we will definitely take questions from the audience. We've got the Q&A function. Those that are watching a live stream can also contribute via Twitter, and the team will pass that through. So do get your questions coming in. I think you can also vote up questions in this format. I'm just going to quickly give you an intro to our panelists, and then we'll move straight to them. So we're joined now by Araceli Camargo, who is a neuroscientist and co-founder of Centric Lab. She's a cognitive neuroscientist, an expert on how people interact with urban environments. She's also one of the authors of the new report with Ollie on red routes. We're also joined by Tiffany Lamb, who's a consultant at NEF Consulting. She leads work on the future of cities, urban mobility, in particular exploring issues around gender inclusive cities. And I have to say, Tiffany, you take the prize in my year since I've been back at Centre for London for having sort of opened my eyes most acutely when you were in our micromobility session last year around issues of gender and cycling. So thank you for that. And we'll hear more about that later on. I'm also joined, last but definitely not least, by Steve Gooding, who is director of the RAC Foundation. He joined the RAC Foundation in 2015, having been Director General at the Department of Transport, where his responsibilities included the first roads investment strategy and the transport strategy for the North. Steve's also worked at the Office of the Rail Regulator and the Cabinet Office. We'll be hearing from all of those in a moment, but Araceli, if I could turn to you next to maybe build on Ollie's introduction and share some of your insights, in particular, sort of broadening out about how different urban environments affect different people and how that might mean we should start thinking about equality in the city. I guess going on to what you think about red routes in particular.
Okay, thanks for that, Rob. So the first place that I would like to go in terms of framing the conversation is that there are no safe levels of air pollution. I think that's the first thing that we have to really adjust ourselves. Somewhere hidden in the 2000, I think they did in 2015, the WHO has it in their policy or their suggested policy handbook on air pollution. They have that statement. There are no safe levels of air pollution, but it's really hidden inside the document. In terms of research, Centric has also done research. We base it on the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. The main thing to understand from that is that it has to do with the stress response. And our stress response is an adaptive response to our environment. It's a very useful response. And it engages at first contact with air pollution, and it tries to mitigate all those horrible reactions that our body has, i.e. to this poison that's coming into our system. And when we look at it from that binary, that there are no safe levels of air pollution, we really have to frame AP as a hazard. And I think that's where we have to work from. Instead of trying to negotiate, do we bring it down to this level? Do we bring it down to this level? Or do we bring it down to this level? Because really, when it comes to our biology, we're affected no matter what. And so we have to start thinking about it like smoking, or the way that we dealt with policy-wise, legally-wise, with asbestos. So I think that's the first framing from a biological side that I wanted to impart as far as that goes. And the second one, in terms of equitability, is that we start creating inequities when we erase people. So in the red routes that they are designed, or they are designated and defined as priority for motor vehicles, then why put people on them, right? There are residents there, there are people that live there, there are little kids that go to school near red routes. So we can't have both, because then that erases those people. And that's what we've done. We completely erase those people. We say we're going to move from LTNs, which are residential, and then we're going to move towards the bigger roads, which arguably then are thought of as non-residential, and that's incorrect. And so it's that erasure that we need to stop doing, because people do live there and work there.
Thanks, Araceli. That's really helpful. Steve, turning to you, I wonder if you could sort of unpack for us a bit the sort of main benefits that you see for red routes. Is it still valid? And maybe just go on to, what do you think the priority should be for London's main roads?
Thanks, Rob. Well, first off, I think I probably ought to explain, for the benefit of the people observing the event, that the RAC Foundation is not a pro-motoring organisation. It was born of the fact, the view taken back in 1991, coincidentally, that if the RAC didn't get real about the challenges and the problems motoring raises, then we'd lose the benefits. And I think that's quite an interesting starting point when thinking about things like red routes. So I think I'm alone in this panel, having been around in the Department of Transport at that time. I remember some very heated debates, passionately held views that you couldn't possibly have a red line on a road because nobody will be able to see it. And here they are, they're still with us 30 years later. And to respond to one of the points someone's made in the chat, those 9 principles were all in place at the same time. They were there in a statement made in 1998 by the then traffic director and notified to Parliament. I haven't been able to find anything quite like them on TfL's website in preparation for this event, and I'm not sure if they're still there. But Ollie mentioned the Roads Task Force, and I think it was a pity in many ways that the Roads Task Force, which was commissioned by the previous mayor and produced some very interesting analysis, rather disappeared from view as soon as a new mayor took over. And I've long been saying, I thought one of the most valuable things that the Roads Task Force did and that TfL adopted was to create a 9-box grid for looking at all roads and streets in London, and to recognise that some of them pose some really difficult trade-offs. And the fact is, the red routes are London's distributor network. They were previously, we'd have thought of them as the strategic road network for London, for the movement around the capital rather than the local traffic. But the cold hard fact of the matter is, in a conurbation like London, we've always built right up to the road, just as we built right up to the railway. So as Araceli has said, we've got schools, we've got hospitals, we've got housing, all fronting onto these roads, and we definitely need to do something about the consequence of that. One of the things I think government could help with here is to give London the same deal as it's given the rest of the country in terms of vehicle excise duty, where I think sharing some of that for London for spending on these roads would be good. But ultimately, the 2 wicked challenges are the vehicles. If we're going to continue to have motor vehicles, those vehicles have got to be cleaned up. A lot's going into cleaning up the buses, but there's a really big challenge there with van traffic. And all of the motor traffic we've seen in London, the fastest growing traffic is the van traffic, and the van traffic keeps the city moving, keeps it alive, it keeps the shops stocked, and it keeps the trades servicing the buildings. So we need the vans cleaned up. We almost certainly do need to keep pressing the active travel message, and we probably do need to be thinking about the speed at but which we can expect to move on distributors, because it's quite possible we need more calming in order to slow the flow. And I don't think that today, if anyone was writing 9 points for the purpose of the red routes, that they would be expecting them to be about getting places quickly. They'd be about getting to places reliably. Reliability is the key, which is why we don't want stopped vehicles holding up other vehicles. There's nothing worse for pollution than vehicles sitting idling in traffic with their internal combustion engines running. So we need to tackle the vehicles. We need to look sensibly at the trade-offs that necessarily apply to those streets, and perhaps give more local people a bit more of a say in what happens to them.
Thanks, Steve. That's really helpful. Tiffany, your response to what you've heard so far, and perhaps shed some light on the different perspectives different users of our street space, our pavements might have that we haven't heard about so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's really important that we address the need to accept the fact that, or just accept that we can't have any acceptable levels of air pollution. And rethinking the red routes is really a larger opportunity to think about public space redesign and who are our public spaces for, what are they for? And I think just in light of the climate crisis, we really need a stronger, more joined up walking and cycling network in London, as in many other major cities, that also enables easy connections to public transport. So championing active travel is important. It's also important to note that active travel and sustainable transport aren't just about movement. We're thinking about public space more broadly, and people need spaces to stop and rest where they feel safe and comfortable, and they don't feel like they have to spend money to be there, especially in light of the increasing privatization of public space. And I think many of us have experienced firsthand from lockdown how challenging it can be to stay outdoors for an extended period of time without having access to toilets or water fountains, or just basic things that we need to support life outside in public space. And in addition to more space for walking and cycling and these basic amenities like benches, water fountains, public toilets, and safe cycle parking, we can also think about public art or greenery to help create a sense of place where people feel like it's okay to stop there. It's a looked after place where you'll be fine if you just stop and rest and hang out with a friend. And it helps promote the idea of eyes on the street by signaling that the place is looked after. At the same time, any street redesign project really needs to consider various perspectives from marginalized communities, especially to counterbalance perceptions among some communities that street redesign projects are associated with gentrification. We've seen strong opposition to pedestrianization and cycling projects in recent years in cities across the globe, from communities with lower income, communities of color who have this association of new cycling infrastructure with gentrification. And this reflects racial and gender disparities in cycling and perceptions of cycling, as well as an overall lack of inclusive representation and community input in green infrastructure planning. And this has led to inequitable distribution of green infrastructure like cycle lanes, and feelings that some communities, particularly wealthier and more privileged ones, benefit more from investments in walking and cycling. So we need to rethink the red routes so that they can facilitate more walking, cycling, and just vibrant public spaces. But this can't happen if an equity approach isn't front and center.
Thank you, Tiffany. Very helpful again. So it strikes me, and I'm reflecting on an event we held recently with representatives from Barcelona, where they really sort of led the way in some ways to radically changing their sort of streetscapes, and they're moving that onto main roads. And it made me think about Holloway Road. Ollie and I have talked about this previously. One of the sort of options would seem to be at one end to radically change major thoroughfares and prioritize heavily local function, including the kind of health and equality aspects. But there's a cost to that. Steve mentioned this is a sort of wicked problem. There are big downsides. How do we sort of collectively think that through better, so that we can make the right trade-offs in the right places? I'm still sort of at a bit of a loss. Does anyone want to come in on that? Steve?
Well, I think it is important that we recognise that there are strongly held views on all sides here. I mean, one thing I think it is worth bearing on, we talked about the fact that London is a large, sprawling conurbation, and different parts look very different. The part of London, southeast London, where I grew up in the borough of Greenwich, has many 1930s and thereabouts streets, and perhaps slightly older. And many of them, you can see the front gardens have been paved over, and there's one or two cars or a car and a van and at almost every house. And I think we've got to recognise that's where we're starting from. So we might have a sense of how we'd like the place to look and function in the future, but if we're starting from the point where frankly, many Londoners are voting with their wheels, then we've got to think, what are the implications for them, and can they be invited, persuaded that they would have a better, happier, healthy lifestyle, as would their children, if things were different? I think one of the things that the current mayor, who I don't agree with on everything, but one of the things that he has been successful in doing is arguing the importance of tackling air quality as an issue that's affecting the capital's children. Because I think that really resonates with people. And if we start with, this is why we're doing something, and this is the outcome, and this is why it's going to be better for you, that's where we need to be getting to. But it's very hard to do that if people are worried that the result of changing the policy for this network is going to mean fewer things on the shop shelves, or later delivery of things. You mentioned home deliveries not happening, perhaps. It's not an easy debate to have, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't have it. And lastly, I would say key to that is it will be good to have some more data on exactly how much traffic is there, what sort of traffic is there, and to what extent is that traffic actually efficiently carrying people. Some of the data that Ollie and I discussed before relating to things like cycle superhighways reveals that at certain times of day, they're actually enabling more people to travel than previously. And what we need to see is how well is the network performing.
Thanks, Steve. Araceli, I'll come to you in a second. I just wanted to throw that in on the data point. I know from talking to firms and other people in the industry that deliveries are up something like 50%. Delivery journeys are up something like 50% over the last year alone. So that's a lot of what's going on, is we're asking for stuff to come to our doorsteps, and that's arriving in the form of often a car or van. Araceli.
Yeah, there seems to be a need to frame things away from the individual, right? So we are very, at the moment, the conversations are, will you be a car driver? Will you not be a car driver? Not necessarily the most helpful conversation. We might need to look at these things systemically in order to understand, first of all, what are the elements, both behaviorally or human-based, but also, and I mean that in a big global sense, so our consumer habits, our transport needs and habits, alongside driver habits, to understand what puts the biggest burden on the red routes, right? Is it that we need to start looking at how construction is mitigated, at how we do transport goods and services? Because those two things, construction and moving goods and services, are the biggest burden when it comes to transportation, not people. Because again, it's all about erasure. We talk about globally or on a macro level marginalized people. What does that actually mean? It means that for a person with neurodiverse, is part of the neurodiverse spectrum, they might find everything to do with public transport incredibly difficult for them because of their sensorial experience. They may feel very safe in a car. It might be that there is a single parent having to transport and care for an elderly parent, but also transport various children to different activities, and public transport is simply not an option. Or they might be elderly. And so it's not a question necessarily of, it's a question of how are we transporting from A to B? Because I think we can all agree that that is an essential. It's essential to everything, including biology, right? Our cells transport information from A to B, our blood is transported from A to B. So the thing of transport is essential. So then we have to tackle how are we doing that? And to do the how correctly, then we have to understand why people are using cars like I said, at a global, who's putting the biggest burden, and then how do we do that more effectively? Because the last thing that we're not talking about is that the car is only a very small portion of the air pollution that we're breathing in and red routes. It's also the materiality of the red routes, such as the concrete, the fact that there is low green on red routes. So I just want to make sure that we're not looking at the tail of the elephant and thinking it's a zebra, rather than looking at the whole elephant, so we can really identify the issues and have more enriched conversations than just binary conversations.
Thanks, Araceli. That's a great image. I want to turn attention to the questions that have been coming in. Thank you, everyone, for putting questions in and for upvoting. Do keep them coming. I'm going to try and do justice to some of them. I may not be able to get through all, almost certainly, and I will not be able to do the full kind of reading through all of them. Some of them are quite long. I think we've dealt with, to a degree, the most popular question at the moment from Robert Blake about courier services, deliveries. So I'm going to turn to the one from Spencer. Thank you, Spencer, for your question. And it seems it's sort of got two parts, really. Oh, it's just disappeared from my screen. Oh, there we are. And he's talking about bus networks, cycle superhighways, and ride-hailing apps. So three different bits of our transport ecosystem. And is wondering in particular about those things, whether they have, do they have a sort of poor pollution effect or a good pollution effect? And then related to that, more specifically on cycling, I think he's querying, and forgive me if I've got this wrong, that the allocation of road space to cycling is super inefficient, and that essentially we're just creating dead space and taking road space away from more useful, vehicle permission, if that makes sense. So, any comments or thoughts on either of those 2 points?
I think allocation of road space to cycling. I mean, if we're talking about segregated cycling infrastructure that makes it safer for many different types of people to be cycling, and I think that's very important. I think people can come at different perspective as to what makes safe cycling infrastructure, but and I think we need to take that into account, even when we talk about, and in our report, Araceli helped make the point that, we talk about 50% of all car trips could be cycled in about 10 minutes, but technically, yes, they could, but then can they actually be transferable without a fundamental change in the types of cycling infrastructure that's made available? And I think the red routes have a big place to play there, because they are. It's about the reliability that Steve was talking about. Cyclists, people jumping on bikes also want that reliability, and they can get it on those roads. The challenge I think we've got is, when I was talking about the difference between short and medium term changes, you just mentioned bus lanes and cycling infrastructure. We know that speed kills, for example. Why don't we just have 20-mile-an-hour speed limit on these roads, quite frankly? We know that diesel kills. Why are we not planning now for the next 10 years, 15 years, that actually there won't be any more diesel on these roads? And, the same with cycling infrastructure. Why are we not actually saying in 5, even up to 5 years time, we're going to have segregated cycling infrastructure on the majority of these roads, just as I believe Sustrans are asking for from the mayoral candidates at the moment. So I think, there's some frustration in this, and that I try not to express too much in this discussion about, we know some of the solutions that just need to be brought in today that are going to resolve the issues that we're talking about.
Thanks, Ollie. Anyone else want to come in on those points?
I just want to add that there has been a boom in walking and cycling during the pandemic, and part of supporting that growth and ensuring that it's inclusive is creating more space for walking and cycling and taking into account various perceptions of safety. So gendered perceptions of safety, like safety from street harassment and other forms of gender-based violence, or also safety from hate crimes for certain communities of color. So that's one aspect. And I also want to say something about expanded bus networks. So I think we have to remember that London is kind of an anomaly in the UK in terms of its very robust and just well joined up bus and tube network, because since the 80s, buses in the UK, after deregulation, that's led to just increased fares, less reliable service, and poor customer service, just experiences on buses in most parts of the country outside of London. And this has been particularly gendered because women rely on buses more to make short distance journeys, which typically relate to education, domestic or caregiving purposes, and sometimes the work commute. So expanding the bus network and electrifying buses would be particularly beneficial in terms of ensuring that women have access to clean buses, and obviously many other people benefit from buses, but also it continues to create and strengthen the public transport network, which will help reduce car dependence.
So it strikes me that red routes, thanks for that, Tiffany, that red routes, one of the sort of big benefits that we've had from them has been the flow of the bus network. It's been part of the bus revolution you've been talking about. Does that make you does that make your kind of core position on red routes, Tiffany, essentially in favour? Because they're pro-bus?
I think there is a role for more walking and cycling along red routes, but also just rethinking of the routes that the red routes serve and the types of journeys and just the various gendered, racialized, classed and other impacts, and how, just the distribution of the benefits and the disadvantages or negative externalities of the red routes aren't felt equally across London's population.
Fair enough. I want to move to the question that's come in from Toby. Thanks, Toby. And this is really going to kind of economic function and the difficulties, I guess, and challenges. Steve called them wicked challenges earlier around how we manage our trunk roads, our main roads, and that is sort of policy around loading and unloading and commercial use, I guess. It's a big deal. Perhaps not as much light shone on it as you might. I was going to go to Steve here, but this is open to anyone. In terms of these tensions that we have around flow and like stopping and starting, do we feel like we've got them in the right place? Do we need to? Where does this sit in a future kind of policy for main roads? And Toby's point is really around. He highlights that there are sort of exemptions granted often now to make it practical for commercial users of trunk roads. Where should we take this? Anyone?
Well, I'm happy to start the ball rolling, and I think I'm going to cast further forward here. So one of the projects that I know that's being run out of, I think it's out of Zenzig and the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, is specifically looking at the extent to which automated vehicles could play a role in changing the way we think about our logistics world, and in particular within that, the way that we restock our shops. Now, it would be possible to envisage a system where deliveries were really happening in the silent hours, or what we think of them. I know we think of London as a 24-hour city, but quite a lot of it does go to sleep at some point. And if we could take more of the unloading out of what we think of as the most stressed times of day into the nighttime, that will be a help. I think that to do that, we don't really want to have lorries with the reversing alarms going off, waking everybody up. And perhaps we just do need to press more and rethink how much is delivered and by what means. I mean, there's been some success, certainly, with cargo bikes, and some people have been mentioning the role they could play in the chat. There's certainly scope for rethinking the way that freight is delivered and consolidated to have more efficient use that way. But ultimately, I think that having a stopped vehicle obstructing the flow, if it is to be the case that motor vehicles of some sort or other are going to make their way through, and I'm including buses there, you just don't want stuff in front of the bus. You want the bus to get through on time, nice and smoothly. Doesn't have to go all that fast because it's pulling up at stops along the way, but we want to get to where we're going when we expect it to get there. And I think that for me would have to be one of the ongoing defining features of what is, as I've said before, designed originally as a distributor network.
Anyone else? Any thoughts on that point?
Sorry, can I just answer Nick Lester Davis, who's come up with a point about nighttime deliveries being red herring? The red herring bit, and I absolutely accept, many retailers don't want to be there to accept deliveries at 3 o'clock in the morning. But part of the project that Zenzik is running is to look at how you not only automate the vehicle arriving, but whether you could automate the receipt of the goods. And I think that would be a game changer if you didn't actually have to have people there at all. Sorry about that.
Thanks. Araceli, then Ollie.
I just want to ask, why do we constantly keep solving that we're not solving the human problem, we want to solve the commercial problem? If we understand that air pollution is a poison, we have to start the other way around, because otherwise we're just going to keep going in circles. So looking at equitable mobility, Centric is going to do a report on that and what are equitable mobility zones to get people moving safely through London, but also getting people to start changing the way we have to change the way we live. We can't continue to say we need our goods and services whilst we die of air pollution. Even if we switch it over to the night, what are we going to do? We now expect people to breathe in higher levels of air pollution during the evening. We can't do that. At one point, we're going to have to really ask ourselves the question, which way do we want to go? Do we want to continue breathing in this dirty air? And like I said, this fallacy that we've been put in our head that because it's a measurement of 10 or it's a measurement of 5, we're doing better, means that our health is better. That is not the way biology works. Just because we reduce it a little bit doesn't necessarily we're going to get the impact biologically. So I really just want to make sure that we understand that we're going to have to really be binary in this case. Do we want the human problem solved and not breathe in dirty air, or do we want our goods and services and our construction at the rate that we have it at the moment? Because without looking at which way do we want to go, we will go in circles and we are going to continue breathing in dirty.
Thanks, Araceli. I want to ask you all now a quick fire yes, no question. If you could all try and answer, that would be great. And this is just, I'm just paraphrasing really a question that's come in anonymously about Silvertown Tunnel. I assume all of you know something of Silvertown Tunnel. It's essentially a road tunnel, a new one that's planned and budgeted at the moment, as I understand it. It's a little controversial. Are we in favour of, are you in favour of building Silvertown Tunnel as is? Yes or no? Ollie?
I think I find it very difficult to agree with building new roads at the moment in the context of this discussion.
Tiffany?
No.
Araceli?
It depends. I have no idea what the analysis has been in terms of equitable mobility. Is it going to help people move in an equitable way? Yes. If it's just to move goods and services, no.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, I'm going to agree with Araceli because I think that's the guts of it. We haven't looked in detail at the business case for this particular scheme. It does seem to be on the expensive side, and you could do quite a lot with the money if you had other priorities. But I'm assuming that the mayor, who was very clear in his transport strategy of what he was trying to achieve across London, must have established that this fits with it.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to turn to the question from Simon Monk in the audience now. His question is, What percentage of motor traffic by type, if you can go into that, do you panelists believe has to or can be reduced in order to deal with pollution, road danger, inactivity, climate, etc.? How quickly could we do it? And what are the top 3 tools for doing it? That's a meaty question. Anyone want to take that first?
Well, we could start with, as I understand, like we're currently at about 64% of trips in London, like public transport, walking, and cycling. And the current mayor has got a plan for that to be 80% in 20 years' time. And that is meant to be delivering a zero carbon city by 2050. And if anyone thinks that is the right sort of timescale we should be working on, then they might be challenged by the conversation we're having today. So I think it gives some broad context about how much change we need to see in how people are moving around, and also the reduction we need to see in goods and services as well. Just talking about that freight discussion earlier. But I don't have the exact figure. But fundamentally we need to see a reduction in vehicles
and just to press you a bit on, sorry, you're right that there's the overarching framework set out by the mayor. But to press you a bit further, where would you go if you could, declare 1 or 2 new policies tomorrow? You've just been elected mayor, say, in May. What would you change to push that in the right direction? What's the most efficient tools, policy answers?
Well, I think there's not enough. There's probably a couple of things. So first, I'd start immediately developing a fairer way for how people pay to use roads in the city. Quite frankly, everyone is asking for this and it's not being looked at. We should be developing that now in cooperation with industry and the people of London to make it, more equitable. Londoners aren't getting a good deal right now. And I think that flies into the freight discussion as well. Right now, to be honest, I kind of feel like it's a bit of the Wild West of just deliveries everywhere, and there's no plan for the near to medium term future as to scaling that back, talking to industry, maybe restricting times of access and the types of vehicles they should be using in the future. But we need to do that as a conversation with industry, right? In the same way when we developed the ultra low emission zone, we said in 5 years' time, 4 years' time, this is going to change, plan now. And I think I suppose the other, well, it's the road pricing, but I think also reviewing, when we're talking about reviewing this road network, if you look at somewhere like central London, I think we should probably have a discussion around, do we actually need the red routes in central London, for example, and actually think of a different way for how that road network is set up and who controls it.
Great. Thanks, Ollie. Who would like to come in on the best ways of reducing car and van traffic?
Well, I'd better make an observation, hadn't I? And I think where I'd want to start with, it is very hard. So let's not pretend otherwise. I don't think this is something that lends itself to an easy win, a silver bullet solution. There are very few quick wins to be had when you're dealing with something that's as ingrained as the extent of motor traffic is in our capital. The fact is, as I think you said, Rob, through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, I think there was a presumption that this country was going to run on roads. And we were still seeing at-scale road building. And we can see examples within London of flyovers and underpasses, which very much put the traffic before the people who were living there. And I don't think any of us is going to be arguing to see a return of flyovers with traffic zooming past people's bedroom windows these days. But I'm with Ollie. I think what we probably do need to do is take a step back. And again, as Aaron Shelley has said, we need to think, what is it exactly that we've got as a problem here? And if the problem is as serious as it appears to be with air quality, then we need to rethink what we're going to do. And I think also we probably do need to have a think about how we get the balance right. So I wouldn't go so far as to say put all of the red routes back into local borough control. What I would say is if I were elected mayor tomorrow, very, very unlikely because I'm not standing, but if I was elected mayor, I'd be very conscious that the vast majority of London's roads are run by the boroughs. And I need to bring the boroughs with me if I'm going to do something different. And I need to make sure that what I'm doing through TfL fits with and complements what the boroughs are doing. And I think it's quite interesting, a point that Spencer Palmer made in the chat, that we're tending to think of the red routes as very much a fixed network of the strategic roads that TfL inherited from the Transport Department. But the boroughs have the opportunity to designate red routes, and indeed one of them has done that, and has done it specifically for the purpose of tackling traffic problems around a school. So not a promoting distribution by road, but making the road in question safer for people getting their kids to school in the morning. So I think a bit of fresh thinking is needed.
Thanks, Steve. Tiffany Aracelli, you're about to be elected mayor. You've got a brilliant idea for reducing traffic. What's your top idea?
I've spoken about the need for a robust and joined up public transport and active travel network. But I think one thing that has been underexplored is the potential to shift van deliveries to e-cargo bikes for urban logistics. A recent Transport for London figure showed that around 14% of vans could be replaced by e-cargo bikes by 2025 in areas where vans and lorries contribute to over 60% of traffic. So this has implications for how we design cycling infrastructure and also the incentives that government will need to provide so that e-cargo bikes are viable for businesses, for logistics.
Thanks, Tiffany. Aracelli, any thoughts?
Well, on the one side, it is to identify, as I said at the very beginning, what puts the most burden on our lungs, right, in terms of air pollution, which is construction and everything that goes around construction and the rate of city growth. And we will have to reach a binary of which one do we want? Do we want health or do we want goods? Technically, if we're all dead, we don't need goods and services. So there is that motivation. Secondly, it's to look at equitable mobility zones. If we're talking about at the human scale or at the individual scale, we have to ensure that our transport is reliable. And I mean transport in the macro sense, streets, buses, the tube. The tube right now is the place where it's the most polluted environment across London is inside the tube. So to get people to go from car to tube, because that might be healthier for the city, it's not healthier for people. We have to look at expense. If it's cheaper to use your private car than it is to use public transport, there's that situation. Of course, people are going to choose the car. And then there is the quality of the experience of getting from point A to B when it comes to humans. I think the quality, including safety from all levels that we have to consider, but we have to do this again holistically, rather than just, again, being binary and expecting everyone to be on a bike or everybody to be running. There are different physical, psychological needs that people have, and that very much guides their point of transport. And we have to be cognizant that there is a lot of variability within that, because again, otherwise we erase people and we end up adding to inequality.
Thank you. Ollie, do you want to quickly come in?
Yeah, I think it's probably worth saying though, if you're jumping in as the new mayoral administration, there are some really immediate decisions that can be taken. Like if we take into account, like I was mentioning earlier, the extent of traffic fatalities on this road network, the extent of pollution, then you can immediately start to say, I want 24-hour bus lanes across this road network. I want a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit across this network. I want to ban staggered pedestrian crossings and make it easier for people to be able to cross the road. And I want a review of the housing stock along this network, and to think how my greener homes grants and things like that can actually go towards to help people that are suffering the consequences today. And then the medium-term solution is around, I want to review this road network, thinking about the discussion that Steve brought up earlier about data, right? Do we really know everything about who is using this road network at the minute and how it's being used? Is it as we had forecast 30 years ago? Really, probably not. And the more we learn about that, the more we can start to make adjustments.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ollie. I think we've probably got time for one more question, and I'm going to paraphrase. So forgive me if I don't get it quite right, Steve McNamara's question in the Q&A, which is really about electric vehicles. And I think the point he's making is if we do the big transition to electric vehicles, which does seem to be underway, does that not solve most of the problems we're talking about in terms of noise, in terms of pollution? Araceli, you're shaking your head. Do you want to come in?
Sadly, it doesn't. It doesn't at a local, and it doesn't at a systemic global level. So at a local level, again, air pollution, the elephant analogy, right? We're just looking at the tail. The air, if we're wanting to solve the air pollution problem, then we have to look at the materiality of the road and tires. That actually contributes a lot to the levels of air pollution. So unfortunately not. It's not going to be our silver bullet. In terms of a global and macro infrastructure, electric vehicles at the moment still require extraction methods, which unless we do in a much more humane and in a less ecocide driven manner, we're going to create inequities in indigenous lands and indigenous people, because we need, well, where some of the materiality for electric vehicles lies within indigenous lands. So we're going to go and pollute somebody else's waterways and somebody else's land. But on top of that, we're going to create further inequities amongst indigenous people, specifically in the Americas and in Africa, where these materials are based. And we can't do that. We can't get our clean air and our green infrastructure at the cost of somebody else's clean air and health.
Thanks, Araceli. Ollie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think that it's worth. I agree with a lot of what was just said. Then, like, electric vehicles will continue to create particulates as well. We've got a big issue with particulate matter. I think as we develop more electric vehicles, we need to prioritize where that technology goes and how it's used and how those limited resources we have benefit society. So thinking about electrifying the bus fleet as a priority, electrifying the taxi fleet as a priority. Electrifying freight and goods and services as we reduce the number of vehicles as well, but actually sending the signal today to industry that actually in the future you'll only be able to access certain roads if you're fully electric. And I'm not talking about hybrid technology, which is quite a lot of the time a waste of time. Actually sending that signal now so that we get that transition and priority in those areas today, so that we can actually plan and change the road network. That's what we're lacking at the minute. That's sort of like 5-year vision, 10-year vision of where we need to go.
Thanks, Ollie. I realised as you were answering that I committed an error that annoys me when other people do it, which is I made EVs synonymous with electric cars. Electric vehicles, really, we should talk about in all sorts of ways. You talked about electric buses there, but we're also talking about very small vehicles potentially. And anyone, one last thought on the EV question? Is it the great panacea?
No, it's not
we'll wrap up.
It's not the great panacea. Sadly, I wish it was, for the reasons that others have said. It's a solution to the tailpipe problem, but there are other things that we need to address, and people in the chat have mentioned it. There are safety issues that Ollie keeps reminding us of as well. And if we just simply shift the entire fleet we've got, cars, buses, vans and all, over to electric, we're still going to have traffic jams to deal with. So it's not a panacea. It is, I think, part of the solution. And I would like to echo your point, Rob, that we need to be thinking beyond cars here. We need to be thinking about delivery vehicles, and I'm deliberately saying that, not necessarily vans. Delivery vehicles, other types of vehicles that are coming along. I note that this month, Harley-Davidson have started selling 2 electrically boosted bicycles. I think if you're looking for a sign that things might be changing, it's right there in front of you.
Tiffany, I'm going to give you the last word. EVs, panacea or not?
I agree with what others have said. It's not a silver bullet. It can be part of the solution, but ultimately replacing one type of vehicle with another won't do anything to address the underlying transport inequities that still exist and will continue to exist.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up there. I haven't been able to do full justice to all of the questions. Apologies for that if we didn't get to your question. Apologies if I corrupted one or two of the questions without meaning to. Also, thank you so much for everyone for the very vibrant chat. I think the most vibrant chat I've ever seen in any event. This is clearly an issue which gets people interested. I want to thank all of the panelists for participating. Thank you for your time today, your wisdom, your knowledge. It's been hugely excellent having you here. So thanks, Ollie. Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, Araceli. Thanks, Steve. I need to thank EDF Europe again for sponsoring this event and getting us thinking on this really interesting and important topic. Just by way of closure, I just want to flag up, we at Centre for London do lots more research and have lots more webinars. Keep looking out, sign up to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter at Centre for London if you want to keep in touch. And just related to this topic, we've got two research projects up in the air, not up in the air, underway, in flight, I mean. One looking at the whole freight and deliveries ecosystem in London. If you're interested in hearing more about that, do get in touch with me directly. We're also doing research on micromobility, so the wider set of small vehicles, including cycles, e-cargo bikes and the like, and what that might and should and could look like in London. So plenty more places to get involved in some of these topics. Look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you all so much. That's the end of the event. Goodbye.